Hello and welcome to the AI Digest. My name is Joaquin and I'm your host. With me today is Prasad Yalamanchi, CEO and founder of Lead Semantics. It's a pleasure to have you, Prasad. How are you doing?
Thank you, Joaquin, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here with you.
How are you doing today? And where are you
I'm,
calling it from?
I am doing very well, thank you, and hopefully you had a good Christmas break. I am actually currently traveling in India. The last several times that we had spoken, we had spoken when I was in Raleigh, in North Carolina.
Excellent. Um, Prasad, you have over 20 years of experience in computational linguistics and knowledge based systems. Can you give us a little bit of background as to what computational linguistics is and what constitutes a knowledge based system?
So definitely that's a very interesting question. Just to kind of start right off the bat. First, a couple of minutes about my background, and then I'll get into it. And even as part of my background, I'll have to speak about linguistics and so on. So I have a master's in computer science way back when. I am not even going to tell you when I had it from. It would date me long, long time ago. But my interest has been in linguistics, and I have been involved with knowledge-based systems for most part of my career. And as you mentioned, definitely more than 20 plus years. Uh, and uh, I mean, so the to your question of what constitutes a knowledge-based system, right? Knowledge-based. So we have seen any number of IT systems by now. I mean, everybody in the world is probably familiar with all kinds of IT systems and so on. So what makes a knowledge-based system different than a regular IT system, and where do you draw the line, right? So in order to understand that, you need to understand what sets knowledge apart from information, so to speak. Regular information is already is knowledge. If you look at bits of information, anything, any little bit of information that communicates something to you meaningfully is information. As such, it is knowledge. But knowledge is more than what is being. It's rather any given concept, and any one of these terms will require its own definition. But any one of those concepts that will kind of trigger all other associated concepts, and all of those put together will become the knowledge about that particular concept, assuming and you have the information about all the related things, right? And so that is now a richer connected set of information related to one concept, as we said, and that becomes a kind of a form of knowledge. And systems that focus on this type of connected information related to concepts and so on are the ones that will allow you to make decisions a lot easily. And in fact, those are the ones that will actually lend automatic decision making along the way, because any decision would have to depend on not just information, but all the contextual information, all the information that is related to attendant information and so on, right? Depending on the complexity of the decision. And so without the idea of a knowledge, so a decision is probably, you're not ready to make a decision yet. Did that give you a long-winded so systems that kind of deal with all this aggregate set of information that is all interrelated are kind of across the line of becoming knowledge-based systems.
So, my understanding is that there is a hierarchy of data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. But the
Mhm.
base of the pyramid starts with data, which is these isolated pieces of things, of facts, right? Like date, time, labels, etc. Information is when you combine that with some layer of context, and knowledge is when you have fact based systems, or knowledge is when you can take that information and do something with it.
Right, it is actionable. Yes, you said it correct. I didn't mention it earlier, but it is. The decision is that actionable. So you You may not physically make an action, but it is a decision is an action.
And
Yeah.
then wisdom tells you when to employ or when not to employ knowledge based on different context in a dynamic.
Based on your experience, so, and that's where the wisdom is, the part of it. It's all knowledge, but everybody would have knowledge, but you would know selectively when to use what part of knowledge,
So knowledge
depending
based,
on the circumstance, yeah.
you mentioned knowledge based systems are these systems that are architected where you have interrelated concepts and they represent the
And
knowledge base, right?
they exactly, and they represent enough of information. All of it is connected together to allow you to make a decision. So that you're not no longer running into running another system to provide additional information that is missing to make that decision. So you have it all together, and so the knowledge based system itself is organizing all the bits and pieces of information that is all interrelated towards the purpose of making certain decision or an action.
And as it pertains to anybody who's listening that has a background in computer science and software engineering or database administration, what is the difference between a schema that you would use for a relational database
Yeah.
and a knowledge based system?
So schema is the layout, what to expect when you actually see the data that is conforming to that schema. It's like the metadata. It is like telling you what to expect when you see the streams of data that is being thrown at you, right? For example, right? And on the so-called knowledge also has a schema, except the knowledge is a lot more relevant to the schema of the real world. Again, as I mentioned early on, it is for you to make decisions in the real world context, right? And so the information that you gather, the data that you gather, all of it will be interrelated, you know, as structured by the schema, so-called schema. It has its own name in the case of knowledge, called an ontology. And before we get to that, it is still a schema, for example. But the schema is telling you, how all these things are interrelated. But schema is its definition of the schema this time around is actually dictated by what is in the real world, as opposed to just the data driving you to come up with the schema, as most of the non-knowledge based systems are prone to kind of end up having. They don't necessarily be driven by the real world that they are trying to model in their in these IT systems, because they are just looking at the data and data types and how they are coming, and of course it's related to the application and the domain per se, but they are not rigorously looking at it whether the interrelationships that they are recording are really validated in real world. As opposed to when you are dealing with as a knowledge based system, you're always the benchmark for you, the testing backdrop for you is the real world.
So the schema in a database is closer to systems and the processing of data, but a domain or knowledge base that you architect for a knowledge based system is closer to more expression, more detail, more metadata. It's supposed to reflect what happens in the real world as opposed to just
Absolutely.
how to transmit bits of data.
Right. Absolutely. That's how you are able to really validate whether it is right or wrong. And that's how knowledge based systems are easy for human beings to relate to, because real world is independent of the system, right? So it is a lot easier for people when you pass on between engineers, for example. This is a problem that all companies and businesses run into. It's so much more simpler because the context is the real world for which this system is mimicking the decision processes, the action processes, and corralling data, marshalling data to organize all the relationships.
And when we move to the definition of computational linguistics, if we just isolate linguistics, we've talked about this before, but one of the taglines of your company, of the work that you do, is that knowledge and language are part of the same coin.
Absolutely. And so um, it's knowledge by itself, right? I mean, so we have talked about knowledge without talking about language so far, right? Knowledge is preeminent to language, and language is preeminent carrier of any other modality that you may be aware of, right? I mean, all kinds of ways of communicating anything, you're really communicating knowledge. The purpose of communication is to communicate knowledge. It often seems like, you're communicating information, but it is larger part of a context that is supposed to communicate, some important stuff, right? Something that is relevant to the receiver on the other side. And so that communication, the mechanism of communicating is the language. So the language is, so in that sense, whenever you are encountering knowledge as a human being, you are receiving it through some communication mechanism, and that communication, in whatever be the form, can be a sort of language, and human language is the ultimate form of, it's like such a potent and, rich, carrier of knowledge. And that's how language and knowledge are like, two sides of the same coin. That's the tagline for our company.
So when we look at the computational linguistics background that you carry, you essentially are making human knowledge interoperable with machines for
Yeah.
that knowledge based system, right? The machines should be able to assume a context over what a person would dictate is the context of the real world, so it can perform richer applications. Is that a correct assumption or?
I mean, you are in the ballpark. I mean, so because language up until now, not only up until now, I mean, so see, language is everywhere, right? I mean, I mean, human progress has been because of language, and language is all around throughout our histories. So much of this text and language has been, carried, is stored, and is, transmitted and shared, and so on and so forth. And as I said before, language, wherever you find it, if you can interpret it, you are interpreting it for the knowledge it carries, right? And so all the knowledge in the form of either text and, whatever the format it is, audio, and you name it, is holding some sort of knowledge, right? And now if you want to apply, because as humans, we don't have enough of bandwidth to kind of, handle even, to store enough of, or, handle the knowledge out of what we hear and read, and so on, forget the mass of language and text that is lying around. And so computation is the natural, purpose, or at least is a goal for us to apply it to interpret all the language and text that is there, right? That's how the computational linguistics was, you know, is the goal of computational linguistics, is to make computers understand language.
Okay, so let's talk about lead semantics a little bit. Semantics is a really charged word that has overlap of language and knowledge. I mean, what does it means to it means meaning, right? Semantics, if you boil it down,
Right,
is what does something mean?
right. And now semantics is, as we said, language is carrying knowledge, right? And in order for knowledge to be interpreted, as human beings, we interpret the language that we see, and we absorb the knowledge, right? We find the meaning, whatever is meaningful is one way or another is attached to our concepts that we already know. And so, you kind of recognize that this is the knowledge that I now kind of gleaned off of this piece of, text or language, right? Now, if you want to let the computers kind of, get into this knowledge that is being carried in language, now you need to kind of really break it down, what our mind is doing, you know, in a fashion that computers can get at it.
Hmm.
And semantics is the one that organizes the knowledge in a format that kind of, lets computers kind of, deal with the constituents of knowledge that is being carried in language.
Machines are really good at rote, very predictive, repetitive work.
Right.
and humans are capable of having the richness and context of a dynamic moving world where we have our short term, our long term memory, and we're able to adapt to new pieces of information in real time.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is semantics is the mechanism for language. It's sort of like the grammar, the system behind it, and it allows us to encode machines to be capable of interpreting, writing, interpreting text.
Semantics is, when you extract something out of language, right? When
Mhm.
you extract something, if you want computers to understand, machines to understand what you have extracted, you want the constituents to be you know, in a systematic encoding, so that machine, because machines kind of deal with systems and the patterns and all of that, right? And that is what semantics does for you. It breaks down the knowledge in terms of the constituent parts, which are like concepts, which further breaks down into entities and their relationships with other entities and so on, right? So knowledge is basically that. It's like entities having relationships with other entities could be in full right entities, or kind of again we kind of give separate categories, such as like dates and times, which are like much more fundamental data types. Again, I'm using compute language, but that's when once you establish the equivalence of knowledge that we carry on wherever we get it from, in these formats, like entities and their relationships to other entities, then that is you are applying semantics. And
And
semantics itself is a lot more rigorous in terms of the science of semantics. I mean, it is in set theory and in all of that.
your your um your profession and what you do can also be labeled ontologist, right? Which is deciphering what exists, what doesn't exist, how things exist in relation to each other in a sort of a web, but hierarchical relationship base.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So whenever we talk about ontology, I know knowledge per se, and you asked an earlier question, which is quite, it kind of really points back to this particular part. We talked about schema, right? And schema, when it comes to knowledge, we said it is a little more involved, and it's probably a little more souped up. The schema for knowledge is called an ontology. And
Mm.
what an ontology is, it's like in trying to relate to the real world, you're not only looking at the concepts at hand, maybe in terms of the data that you are handling, you're looking to see how the data at hand or information pieces that you have in hand that you are trying to model, how do they connect to the real world counterparts? They may not be one to one. Like for example, when I'm talking to you, I know you are Joaquin, but in real world, you are also, before I place you in the real world, I need to know that you are a person, right? It's Joaquin is a person, and your gender is male, and all of those things are constitute the additional aspects that are not necessarily part of the original piece of information that I was, maybe I could have, stopped at just saying, okay, this is a name, it's Joaquin and so on, but all these attendant things are what makes you grounded in reality,
And they're,
right?
they're, they're
Yeah.
characteristics that we nevertheless used to decipher one person from another: name, age,
Absolutely. I mean, they
ethnicity.
really place you in real world in that sense. It has placed you separate from me, and so we have our own identities in real world. So all of that is part of where you find in the graph of knowledge. All knowledge in the world is universal actually. Because they all have independent identities, all the constituents, and so it's a large graph. I mean, but of course we are always dealing with one piece at a time, be it one application or one particular situation and so on. But constituents of those situations, being that our inspiration is to connect it to the real world, they necessarily will find their proper place in the complete graph of knowledge of the world.
Hmm.
And so how you organize these connections of all these related terms, like now person, everybody, all humans are persons, for example, right? And so other concepts have now come into play when we were only talking about Joaquin and whatever other things that we were going to discuss. Now all these things have to have a proper organized way that they interrelate, and so that is how you organize it is the science of ontology, engineering.
So you said something that really encapsulates the meaning of ontology. Ontology is a schema of knowledge. I really like that. It's 5 words. Ontology is the schema of knowledge. Okay, maybe
Yeah.
6 words, but
Right.
it's a good way to encapsulate it. You in your organization have created a product over a period of 3 to 4 years now called
Yeah.
Text Distill.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that Text Distill is a configurable
Yeah.
pipeline that consumes or processes text, unstructured data. So that
Yes.
that takes in an ontology as part of that configuration and machine learning model.
Right. If I may explain that a little further, right? So Text Distill is the product that, it's our flagship product. It's something that we have been working for since 2020 or so.
Hmm.
So it all started with, a paper that we wrote, published in Medium that got a lot of attention, and we got our first clients as well with that. But this was when the original BERT model was, the transformer BERT model was coming into the market. So the public consciousness was kind of seeded with this idea of transformers, of being able to interpret language, and so on. And so we really got excited with that because that was a missing piece, we thought. Because we ourselves as a small company could not have envisioned to build something like that, even though we had bits and pieces of understanding in place, but we were not bold enough to go that far, not the had the others to really get that far. But with the advent of this open source bird being freely accessible is when we really launched into creating our real product, Text Distill. And our goal has always been trying to apply semantics to extract knowledge. And because we know knowledge systems are a lot more potent in terms of how productive they are in business situations, because it's so close to the end user to make their decisions, and the automation can be really extended to the far corners of all of what you want, depending on the complexity that you want to deal with. But without knowledge in the middle, you're always stringing together brittle systems, someone to always manage it, and so that kind of thing. So knowledge is a higher level abstraction closer to human thinking, right? And so and being that knowledge is I mean, it's like rich in text, and text is like is laden with knowledge everywhere. And so we thought that is one area, and plus text is this kind of a second child in the organization where it is processed for information extraction per se, so long, even now it is still that way, most of it. But knowledge extraction, even though that is where the primary source it ought to have been, is not to be, because of the complexity involved. Because text is kind of this unstructured, total. There is no structure for a regular algorithm to go. That's when this machine learning and BERT models and transformers, they have helped us, really deal with some of that. And so text distill was born out of trying to literally extract knowledge from text.
In
So
in a,
yeah.
in a normal organization, people rely on people to interpret, create, and extract information from text. People create reports, other people read those reports, and they use that to make some sort of decision or
Yep.
get context or be informed.
Yep.
So you're saying that in 2020 you saw the opportunity to construct this platform, this solution, because a new technology came on the scene that made it possible for you to um, develop this very
Yep.
complex and difficult to produce solution. It's just simply something that requires a lot of specialized time, attention, and skill sets to be able to understand how to really
So
squeeze the juice out of a text document, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and and hopefully we'll get into this generative AI, and where there's considerable overlap, but there is definitely an interesting piece that is left out by generative AI. Clearly generative AI, so I'll just go back to text distill. um, so in order to extract knowledge from plain text, narrative text at that, that is the most complicated part of text, like simple text, small text. The context is a lot simpler. Metadata, around a tweet, for example, gives you half of the knowledge already. And then there are things like that. Of course, the challenge is in the syntax and all the cryptic acronyms that people might use, but that all can be handled a lot simpler. But the narrative text, the in order to get the proper relationships between concepts, and resolve all the core references, all those things in a long form things, like in a book, for example,
Mhm.
like in a
Harry Potter.
novel, for example.
Yeah, Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, for example, so all, forget the complexity related with the nuance of what is being said. I mean, that I think is still a unreachable goal, not easy to reach goal. But whereas the factual aspects of any of these story, even in fiction, there are facts, right? I mean, they are talking about Harry Potter being here and there, and so on. So you can extract all of those things very coherently, and with the technology that we are talking about in text distill. And that is more complicated, and progressively it has become a lot simpler, but nonetheless it still is involved. And just generative AI will not be sufficient. You need semantics,
A
because you are producing knowledge out, you know yeah.
a novel, a narrative story is a sequence of actions, a sequence of events between actors in their environment and other actors. When,
Yeah.
where, what, why, how, when, where, what, where, how. It just keeps unfolding in a chain of events. Harry Potter woke up and he had breakfast. Harry Potter went to go ride a broom to go play a game. Harry Potter cast a spell. It's a series of actions that are unfolding. You're
Right.
saying that right now, at this stage that we're in with technology, we're capable of extracting factual representations of a storyline. But what is difficult, because it still requires a lot more further understanding of how things work, is the nuance in language where we can be sarcastic, where we can
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
embed emotion or build into.
Exactly, the emotion and all that. I mean, of course, you can ask generative AI and give it just a sentence and say, is Harry Potter angry, or is he like kind of, you can even ask for a nuance thing, and it might give you an answer. It might not give you an answer. It can hallucinate all it wants, and all of that. But it becomes as tedious as actually reading it, and making yourself the understanding of what is being written. So it's not practical to get that to that end. But whereas getting the factual end, complete narrative narration of the entire storyline is absolutely possible, and that's what text distill does.
Okay, so you mentioned generative AI. Can you define that? What does that mean?
So generative AI it's been with Chat GPT, it kind of literally stormed the public consciousness, to the point where everyone on the streets would know about generative AI, to the point they kind of attribute everything and anything that it can, there's nothing that it cannot do, including knowledge, and so on. And why I bring that up is I'll have something to say a little later. Generative AI is like in my mind, the way I describe it to my cohorts and colleagues and so on, is like it's a 10 or 15-year-old person who may not be like did not have any experience in the world, real experience, but nonetheless is through his schooling or her schooling is great at producing language, grammatically correct language. And it is absolutely, when you look at sentence by sentence, and when you string up all the sentences the person has spewed out, it makes grammatical sense, and it may be coherent in its own way. But whether it connects to the real world or not, that's a question. Sometimes it might connect to the real world, sometimes it might not. But generative AI is producing these generated words each time, and then it is happening so fast that it appears to just produce as if a person is producing this text or language, you know.
How does
And
that
so, yeah.
how does that work mechanically?
So this is statistically, so generative AI is like, is generated off of a so-called foundational models. These are large language models,
Hmm.
like from OpenAI, and these days there are at least 40 other model producing organizations, including Llama and Orca from Microsoft, and on and on. I mean Falcon from Middle East, and somewhere, on and on. There are like all these models that are coming out. So the essence of it is that they are training it on all the vast amounts of written text that is available on the internet, all kinds of text. It is anything that is on the internet is kind of is fed in for training purposes. And so now what statistically these models are now ready to do is they understand the patterns of any sequence of tokens. So it could be XML, it could be pieces of words, it can be like a Python program. They understand sequences and they know to predict what is at any
Uh,
given place, what token should be there or could be there.
Johnny goes to eat an apple, or Johnny goes to the restaurant. On a blog site, for example, that would
Yeah.
be something that this thing would scrape. It would just look for patterns in how entities engage with other entities and what seems to be
No,
common.
it's not even going that far. I mean, it is just looking at strings. It has seen Johnny goes to, play after he eats, or, something like that. And it has seen it offered enough that, whenever you put Johnny goes, I mean, statistically, the next word kind of, belongs to whatever that it has seen most of the times in the past in its
Mhm.
training. And of course I'm kind of simplifying it, but it kind of there are like parameters like temperature and so on. So there are it may take a group of statistically relevant words, because so many contexts would have Johnny goes to, and may produce different words, right, at varying statistical significances. And so it may pick up top 10, 20, whatever, and then randomly pick any one of them. And so in that sense it can produce not necessarily the same piece of text next time you ask the same question, for example.
And how does it interpret when you're asking it a question that
Yeah.
it should give you a certain response? Where does Johnny go on Saturday night? What does Johnny
It's
like?
again, so you have to extrapolate it back to all the, training data that it has seen, and what has significantly, statistically significant way that it has seen, what is the next word that has the highest probability in this, in the training data that it has seen, that will have the most probability of showing up as the next word. Right now, because we are in a second, third iteration of modifying the behavior of these language models, so all these sophisticated model creating teams have broken down the interactions that will allow specification of what type of role the language model should take on. So it kind of it's reducing the scope within which to look for what patterns are relevant. Like if you behave like a you're now a teacher, for example, or you are now a math teacher, for example. So all the data that it has seen before, now it knows one way or another categorized mathematical data is what it is constraining to kind of look for its probabilities. I'm kind of broadly giving
No, but
you
it's giving a good example of what it is and how it works. I mean,
right.
if you were to
you
ask,
know
"What does Johnny eat?" and the training strings say Johnny eats apples, then it's more than likely gonna say Johnny eats apples. If there's any other context that he goes to get a slice of pizza, then
right.
it might go and say Johnny eats because it's associating the action eating with the strings to apples and pizza, right?
Right. It is kind of literally this string it has seen. It's not by meaning, it's by what it has seen so many times
Guesswork.
before.
It's
Right.
like the kid that you're the kid example. They overheard someone talking about this stuff.
Absolutely,
You
absolutely.
know what it
And
is.
they have
And
heard it enough times, in the family they're talking, in conversations and all that. So they just spew out what they have seen it, but they are making sure it's grammatically correct. So That's how it is. And in oftentimes, let's say, it probably suits the bill. Again, it has to be accepted by a human, somebody that has to interpret it and say, okay, this particular prediction is correct,
Hmm.
right? I mean, without that interpretation and accepting it or discarding it, that's when people, things get into trouble.
And that's what text is still supposed to do. It's supposed to squeeze the juice out of the text
with
and
the
give
with the
you.
knowledge, and that's where the semantic side of it comes in. And the semantics is like, we are looking for knowledge, not necessarily strings of words.
Mhm.
And knowledge, as I said, has to be driven by some ontology, some schema, which is like concepts that the receiving system understands. It knows, right? When I say understand, it knows that it has meaning in its database. So it knows the concepts, and it knows that these concepts are interrelated.
So this is where we go into the topic of the discussion, which was the main meat and potatoes that we wanted to cover, and that's intelligence with knowledge infused generative AI, ikigai, the Japanese term for how to find
Right.
your place in the world and find purpose.
Right.
Um,
It kind of really fits this particular, time, and thing that we do, and all that. Yeah.
as you said, ChatGPT is just a very smart kid who can parrot whatever it thinks people want to hear, but it's missing a core component of knowledge, and
Right.
because it doesn't really understand the context of what an
Right.
adult is asking, it hallucinates. But hallucination is a fuzzy term for me. Can you explain hallucination a little bit more?
Right. So, ChatGPT, its charter is not to say the right thing. That is never the case. I mean, all it is like predict, what is the most appropriate thing, based on what it was trained on, right? Whether it is right or wrong is up to the receiver. Somebody has to interpret, what has been generated. Somebody or something, or some sophisticated system, if that is, you know has to interpret and accept that it is right, and or it is wrong, discard it if it's wrong. And so, and oftentimes it does produce, like for example, just yesterday or even this morning, the Ellen, from Seinfeld, Louis Dreyfus, or I forget the name of the actor. She was actually giving a speech, to the Wall Street Journal, audiences, some investor group, or something like that. And I think, she asked ChatGPT to give her, um, her speech, or produce a speech for her. And then, the speech had, uh, referring to her as an investor,
Mm.
because it recognized Wall Street Journal and, whatever that investor group as the occasion, and probably thought, she would have to be an investor, and so it guessed that, so if you put all this information together, statistically the system would find an investor to be one of the appropriate terms to kind of, really assign it to her. It is that kind of a thing, whereas the real situation is, that's not the correct thing. She is an actor, and and she was going there to kind of receive an award or something like that. You know I don't exactly know the context, but that is the situation. So those are the things that, ChatGPT in its own self, it did its thing, but it produced the wrong thing for that situation. And that is what we kind of, the easiest thing is that it hallucinates, is the word that we use to kind of, characterize what is happening there when it doesn't suit your, the recipient. So you are saying the system it is very sane, it appears to be sane otherwise, but suddenly, you get these things once in a while. And so, and that historically, that's where, we have used the word hallucination.
So misinterpreting the context of a situation based on assumptions, based on not fact based assumptions.
Yes, and, it's fact based or not on the recipient side. It's all the onus is now on the recipient, the receiver, right? And
Well,
how yeah.
ChatGPT doesn't come with a smoking warning label. It doesn't tell you it's going to get cancer. It's going to give you hallucinations. Or it's going to give you,
Right.
false information. on or does it now? I'm not sure. I haven't seen.
I mean,
Haven't seen.
so probabilities of, we can, generation after generation or version after version, it is only getting better. So from 70% accurate statements to, or accurate predictions to 85%, or, something like that. So it is very impressive, the progression, but the 15%, we don't know when that happens. So
Mm,
even if it is 95% and 5% is the only times it hallucinates, you don't know when the next time that you hear is the hallucinating prediction may be. Next 10
yeah,
things could be hallucinating predictions.
it could be counseling a heart surgeon, and they could mess up 5% of the patients, but that's a heavy price to pay. Or a bridge builder, somebody who's.
Right. I mean, absolutely. And I think, this is where, what I was saying is people are attributing and expecting a whole lot out of generative AI, whereas that is not even the charter.
Mm,
What generative AI is great is, whenever there is a human recipient, and now it has gone on to cover all the possibilities, right, of the entire universe of, information that's been on the internet, or, whatever it has been trained on, is now has been processed, and it is now available for it to, uh, you know put it as part of prediction in the next set of words, and, whatever. As an individual, would not have done that. We don't have enough of, time spent on any subject of interest. Whereas now, the onus is whether what it has produced is right or wrong. It now could have produced right thing, but right thing that you would have by yourself never found time to research and, find it, all that. So in that sense, it is great.
it's a good interface for general knowledge,
Absolutely, as long as you know what to tell, whether it is right or wrong,
but
when
when
it
you need
produces it.
specialized knowledge, you need that initial component of where you specialize your career in,
Right.
right? Knowledge base system.
Absolutely. And just I'm trying to be a lot more logical, so your, audiences are also kind of, finding, connections back into, what they can think about, and so on. The way, you say something is right or wrong as a recipient, right, that ChatGPT produces, is based on the facts that you know,
Mm,
right, or your prior knowledge,
hmm.
right. And in that sense, the that is how you rule out that, or you conclude that this has hallucinated in the past, or, now, or so on.
It's true. If you don't know, you could be getting
Yeah,
bamboozled.
absolutely, absolutely. If you don't know, then you are accepting it, and that's like, we are kind of, delusion kind of, carries forward. Whatever has been hallucinated, it passed on, and it kind of, metastasizes into some kind of a delusion that carries through populations. And that happens, rumors, and, all of that. I mean, all kinds of stuff that we hear in the news, right? Yeah. When there's no proper judgment that is put on, what is heard, or when the person that is applying the judgment doesn't have the right background or the factual knowledge to verify it.
Mm. So, what can we do to make full use of this technology? I mean, I think that's kind of what you're doing. That's
Absolutely.
part of your work, isn't it?
So I really admire what Microsoft has done. So Microsoft has, by even before this AI and, all this has come into play, they have this application base, where individual users are interacting with these Microsoft products, right? Like spreadsheet and PowerPoint and Word and, so on. User is interacting with it. So that is the context in which user is actively interacting, engaging with the software that Microsoft produces.
Hmm.
Now, with the generative AI being made available as Copilot, right? In a word, when you're writing whatever, generative AI is giving you like a monster, oracle that knows about everything in the world, producing, predictions and, things like that for you, and you are there to verify whether it is right or wrong. And when it is right, and even though it is right, you know it to be right, but you would not have by yourself researched or had the time to research, or no places to go to research for it, and
Hmm.
the Copilot is giving you that information, right? And that way it has really bolstered your productivity, right? And clearly that is a situation where there is an active judge that is kind of receiving the prediction.
Even just the scaffolding knowledge, because it doesn't need to be precise for you to just get something on paper, right? I mean,
Absolutely, absolutely. So, the variations of predictions that are coming out, it some may not be actual factual facts, but somewhere along the way, I mean, it may be like filling a gap somewhere, and it may be triggering some insight in you, and things like that.
We need to bring this back to knowledge based systems because the value goes in
So,
precise facts based retrieval,
so
right?
now this is one context where users are actively engaged, right? Now there will be a lot of systems, automation, especially when you are ambitious and you want to make automated decisions and things like that. You know, there is no active person in the middle. Generative AI can be applied anywhere, as we can see now, right? Every place
Mhm.
there is something to be interpreted, or something to be understood for it, all the patterns that exist. Generative AI can be applied. So every piece of an automation, you can only imagine how many different places you can apply generative AI. But in order for it to be properly validated and accepted into the next part of the pipeline of processing towards a fully automated end-to-end system, you need knowledge, the knowledge of what is correct and what is, much like a human,
Mhm.
right? Right, we said human is the one that is endowed with the factual knowledge to actively interpret and say something is right or wrong in this context, right? Now you
Mhm.
want up downstream system to be able to do something like that, either in the sense of a schema that it is accepting. A schema is like something that it knows, this is the only format and this is the only type of relationships that I expect, the constraints. So that is the knowledge that you are instilling into this pipeline stuff. I mean, that's where knowledge systems come in order to do end-to-end automated systems. You need knowledge systems, and in order to do knowledge systems, generative AI is one piece, and the rest of it is like knowledge-based systems, you know
How do you weave them together to do something?
So that's where, like in text distill, for example, we actually take in text on one side, extract, all these facts, like concepts and interrelationships between these concepts. Now they have a narrative and they have a provenance back to, where they were found in the text. So we retain all those links. Now, once this graph is created, all these concepts interlinked and so on, we ensure, to fit the target knowledge graph. A target knowledge graph has an ontology and all of that, right? And so we make sure the interrelationships that we find in the text, right? For example, if you say it is ESG related or it is legal related ontology or knowledge graph that you are working with, because there is a ESG related decision process system that is working off of this knowledge graph. Right now, we are extracting knowledge from text and completely ferreting and corralling, marshalling it to the knowledge graph automatically. And in order for this extraction to be accepted by the knowledge graph, it needs to fit the schema, which is the ontology of that knowledge graph.
Mhm.
And so we do that automatically.
So there's a graph data structure that you're
Yeah,
referring to as a knowledge graph, and ontology being the schema of knowledge serves as the interpreter of how you process text. So you feed a text, and it recognizes that there are things in that text that are of relevance to this graph. So it fits it inside, and then makes relationships between those things. Is that what it's doing?
right. So in text, how are relationships formed, right? So when we say,
Sentence.
you and I had a conversation, right? The relationship, now there is a relationship vis-a-vis this particular context. You and I, you, if it is dereferenced to be Joaquin and I dereferenced to Prasad, are conversing. So conversing would be a relationship, or or talking, or or participating based on the context of text, the narrative text surrounding where we found you and I, right? It is that interpretation, the pragmatics of interpreting this narrative text is what is being handled in text still. So
Mm,
it extracts these concepts, assigns them proper entity labels. There is a huge concept of entity linking and so on. We're not
mm,
getting into the engineering of it, but so to resolve, to you to Joaquin Melara, as opposed to just leaving it as Joaquin, because there could be other Joaquins all over.
mm.
uh, you know So, and Joaquin Melara of the Swarm community, and all that. It's a resolution process, right? So that is outside of what we are talking about here. But once you do all that, then we know who we are talking when we say Joaquin, when we say similarly Prasad is the CEO of Lead Semantics, and all of that stuff. And so we are the entire context kind of gives what relationship is actually material and what is actually authoritative in this context.
What you said something interesting. You said resolution.
Yeah,
The so you're saying that there may be multiple Prasads, multiple Joaquins
yeah.
referenced throughout a document, and that could be one person or that could be multiple people, but we don't know that, right? We as
And
humans understand implicitly when you deal with one or two people. Sometimes we make mistakes. If you have
yeah.
Joe this and Joe that, but um, you're saying that that is also part of the process of understanding.
Absolutely. And without that, you won't create knowledge.
Mm.
So, and when you say implicit, that is the beauty of human mind, or the complexity of human mind, right? And so many things are kind of happening just in a jiffy, right? In such a matter of minuscule amount of time. Resolution, observation, I mean, so many things are happening. They are like there overlapping activities that are happening. So if you want to compute all these things, you have to unravel systematically what is going on. So one of those things is that you have to identify that this is a noun in the sentence, or in a context where you has appeared or Bakin has appeared. Because we know we can attribute additional meaning when it is a noun, and we can add, through machine learning and things like that, we know it to be a person. But now it leaves it out to be, which person is this,
So
right?
this,
And so, yeah,
yeah, this is getting me to ask you. Okay, so you have the skill of modeling the schema of knowledge, so that you can do it. You can make an ontology, and you
right,
have this platform that can consume text with an ontology.
right.
But you're not an expert heart surgeon. You're not an expert weather a meteorologist. You're not an expert master brewer of beer. So
Right.
how are you qualified to go and create an ontology for any of these highly specialized areas?
Absolutely fantastic question. So I'm a computer scientist, a linguist and computational linguist at that. I know to organize information and use all the set theory and ontological, how to organize or come up with ontologies, how to organize the logical schema of you know organizing a particular domain specific information. But what relations are prominent, what are legitimate relationships, what are legitimate concepts in a domain experts will have to kind of contribute that much. Once they lay it out, together, the domain expertise and the ontology engineering expertise, they both have to come together to organize this ontology, right?
So you have,
And
you
yeah,
you have to work with the experts to be able to map
right,
out how it works.
right. I mean, ultimately, but we have gotten a lot more sophisticated at this time, because again, ontology itself is knowledge, right? I mean, how things are interrelated. Like, when you talk about brewery, all the malt and whatever. There are things and they are interrelated to different things, and all that stuff, right? So the ontology related to that is also knowledge, and that knowledge can be in documents, right? Because we said language is the preeminent form of communicating knowledge, and ontology as knowledge can still be best communicated in documents, and those documents again can be interpreted through text distill. Only this time you would need upper ontology, so called the general purpose ontology, upper level, like concept. There are few several upper level ontological, like all the way up to nouns and pronouns, and all of those things, like grammatical things can be leveraged as well to identify important concepts of these documents and interrelationships, candidate relationships, things like that. We can extract them, come halfway, and then with a domain specialist, we can unlike before, we used to spend definitely require as much time from a domain expert. Now we would not need as much to create a valid ontology of that domain.
That makes sense. Experts produce knowledge and they write it in documents so that they can spread it to inform people of their knowledge or provide some sort of recommendation on how to
Absolutely.
make a decision happen.
Uh,
So you're
Absolutely.
taking
And
this book
because
and using that as a starter.
absolutely. And and this is where, because how you encode knowledge in language is like, using these concepts of hypernyms and hyponyms and, all those metonymy and, things like that, they all come in, and they will unravel things and, they will put it into, various buckets, gives, the software a lot more handles in terms of interpreting this text without ever knowing the domain,
Okay, so who should reach out to you? Who should be engaging with you, and for
So
what
we
problem?
are we are in, I mean, we have been at this text distill software, perfecting it with all the technology that has been evolving alongside, and lately in the last year, generative AI, we have retooled text distill with generative AI, and it is generative AI with semantic technology. Both combined together are interpreting much like a person a document and extracting it and putting it into a knowledge graph. You know, and then we are able to provide a natural language, you know, query to this knowledge graph that is generated. And so it's completely open text search. You can literally ask your question and then it interprets, goes back and gets the information from the knowledge graph, and then whatever it produces, you have the backlinks to the underlying text all the way. So in that sense, the original raw source text is acting like a database. You don't even need intermediate database. You're able to literally search through millions of documents, and then you're able to prove to yourself that indeed an answer that the text system has produced is rooted in actual provable text that it actually brings up.
But
And
don't you need
so people that have I'm sorry.
don't you need some sort of database system? I'm sorry, that sounds
Yeah,
really
so
true.
intermediate database is intermediate database is we use semantic triple stores, but people don't need to worry about it as end users, like organizations that have a lot of unstructured data and text, and they are worried that text is not participating in their decision processes enough, like their other structured data sources like relational databases and so on, when knowing fully well that text could actually hold most knowledge, most potent knowledge at that, in terms of making consistent decision making and so on.
Hmm.
And they could reach out to us, and we can literally get unstructured data, extract knowledge, put it into a knowledge graph format for them to literally feed their knowledge systems, decision systems.
And the interface between people for that would be generative AI, so that generative AI can pull facts from the documents, but it can still leverage its strengths of being able to statistically interpret requests or inquiries.
Right. The interface to text distill, you mean? Text distill itself is, you do natural language interface, total natural language interface. You just feed the documents, be it tweets, be it, large documents, be it books. You just feed them on one side. Of course, it has all the underlying configurations that you need to keep in mind. There are machine learning, and we use generative AI in the middle. LLMs are a big part of it in order to interpret the text, to extract all the facts and put it into a so-called fact graph first. And then
Mm.
fact graph is readily available for, again, generative AI interfaces like natural language interface to query and produce all kinds of answers that have provable links back into the text. Additionally, this fact graph, you can apply rigid ontological constraints and promote it into a proper enterprise knowledge graph. So in that sense, it produces two things. You are able to automatically generate enterprise knowledge graphs from text, as well as be able to produce most tractable search than even RAG based searches, which is really popular. And we, in the pipeline for text distill, there is a RAG component as well, the vector database component as well, in terms of extracting knowledge and putting it into that fact graph. But knowledge graph as an intermediary to support search is a lot more accurate than just leaving it at RAG based extraction.
Do you have
So
any
you get search and knowledge graphs. Yeah.
do you have any last words that you'd like to give as a recommendation for people that are dipping their toes in generative AI, or they're coming to the reality that a ChatGPT for an enterprise or a commercial model is not sufficient to get the full use case that they want to flesh out. Do you have any words of advice for them tackling that space?
Absolutely, absolutely. Great question. So in an enterprise situation, you're always trying to produce something that is dependable. Somebody will one way or another attribute it back to you, right? If you are the one to produce. So you would take it with a grain of salt and wherever you get your help from. ChatGPT is one of those additional sources. It can expand your possibilities in terms of producing the right output, provided, you put the filter to verify it is correct and, not correct and so on. That is one way as a human to kind of produce your outputs and so on. But if you want to automate, if you want to do the next big thing with generative AI, you would, in an enterprise situation, the value is that much more bigger, you know, when you couple it with semantics and knowledge graphs.
Any tactical pieces of advice on how they should handle that?
So the the tactical, so your goal ought to be like, if in the enterprise, for example, if there is a knowledge graph already that is being worked out in the organization somewhere, it's good to know, what type of knowledge graph it is, what is the ontology that the knowledge graph is, built with. Then, whatever the outputs that you are generating from your text inputs, you make sure that, it conforms to that, so that, all of whatever is produced can be promoted, can be populated into that final knowledge graph, which can now, bolster the overall decision environment, because whatever is in the knowledge graph is tend to be, that much more dependable for
So,
decision process. Yeah.
so although people want to dip their toes into this very exciting field, they should dip it cautiously and make sure that everything's rooted in knowledge, and every experiment that they produce,
Yeah.
their proof of concept or pilots, they should be wary to ensure that the expected outcome consistently comes out and reflects facts, because whatever you put out there, people will attribute to your organization. Are you a liar? Are you imprecise? Or are you bringing facts to them?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you said it so right. I mean, it is that particular premise that really puts the onus on, whoever is using ChatGPT in an enterprise environment to, take on the mantle of verifying the outputs and putting it out. In that sense, generative AI is extremely useful, and it's fairly easy. Just that the rigor of, actually verifying what it outputs, and added to that, a little more sophisticated environments where knowledge graphs are there and knowledge is, in order to verify the outputs of ChatGPT, you know what facts are, and in order to know what facts are, it is better to know, the knowledge that is relevant to the domain and the enterprise and the organization, the context, and so on.
As you would in any college scenario, you're not going to write a essay or a 20-30 page thesis on something you have no background on and expect not to get grilled or poked full of holes by people that actually know about that stuff. So why would you do it with a machine?
Absolutely, absolutely right. And as a student, because you are learning, for example, and so, but how would you produce that you haven't really thought about and verified it with in your own experience? Maybe you could have concluded wrongly, but you would have one way or another reached that conclusion by verification of some sort.
Mm,
And without that, I mean, it will be fairly easy to kind of tell this is, oftentimes, anything that is totally produced by chat gpt or anything like that is very nicely written, probably 10 lines at length sentences, appearing to be pretty sophisticated and so on, but they appear to be bland. There is not enough emotion, there is not enough contextual basis. Emotion is rooted in context. There is, you're always, whoever is producing this text has somebody in their minds addressing it, so that would be missing. uh,
mm. Yeah, I agree with you. There's something about that synthetic text generated that I can pick out, and I usually ask people, "Hey, was this generated by ChatGPT?" No disrespect, but I'm just curious because it's
Right.
missing some context, or it's embellished in a different way, or the style, the structure reflects some sort of redundant logical element that wouldn't
Right.
come from a person that put the thought to put this together, unless they
Absolutely.
sleep right or you know.
No, even then, it is fairly easy if you are actually reading it. I've heard about anecdotes where students that they use Chat GPT to produce these essays, and then on purpose they go there and just change certain words here and there, misspell it, and or change the word to make it look like they have produced it all themselves. But still, the emotional content is where they give it away.
Mm. And the consistent style throughout the whole. How do
Absolutely,
they
and,
write?
right, and the maturity level of I mean, all of that. Yeah, the human aspect kind of gets reflected in the finesse that you develop over gaining that experience of writing it.
Hmm. Yeah, Tiffany, the 5-year-old, won't use conundrum in a sentence unless she's using ChatGPT to write a story on her behalf. She wouldn't have that schema in her head of that word or vocabulary.
Right.
Anyway,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I appreciate you coming on, Prasad. It's always a pleasure talking with you. And yeah, thanks
Thank
again.
you so much, Joaquin. It's been fun. I mean, and thank you so much for letting it to be a little more open format, so which is makes it that much more interesting.